Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me tonight. Tonight's story is a pre-record, so I'm not trying to trick you, make you think this is live. I couldn't do a live on this Friday, so I figured I'll do a pre-record anyway because the most important thing is to get in a ghost story. So, tonight's story. Wait, before we do that, we need to light our camera, or light our candle. I'm sorry. There we go. Now it's story time. But before we can get into the story, we need a little bit of history background because tonight's tale deals with the Civil War. And we all know that the Civil War was the bloodiest event for Americans in the history of this country. Now, what you may not know is that one of those days was the bloodiest of the bloodiest. And that day was the battle that took place on the Battle of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam took place in Maryland, the state of Maryland, on September 17th, 1862. And on that day, 24,000 Americans were either killed, wounded, or captured. By far the greatest casualties this country has ever seen in its history. In fact, that number of casualties exceeded the combined total of the prior 3 wars the young nation had gone through. So the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Mexican-American War. More people died on the day at Antietam than in all of those 3 wars combined. Now, one of the most famous part of that fateful day was the now infamous charge of the Fighting 69th Irish Brigade. Fighting 69th from New York, Irish Brigade, conducted a charge against the Confederate line, 350 yards. That's pretty big, more than 3 football fields, charging head-on at the Confederates, which took over 4 hours. As a result of that charge, the Irish Brigade lost 60% of its men. Over 540 men died from that brigade on that day. And it's actually believed that the 69th got its name, the Fighting 69th, from no one other than Robert E. Lee, who, when reflecting on that day's event, had asked his generals, what was that brigade that charged so vehemently and wouldn't quit at our center on Bloody Lane? And he was told it was the Irish Brigade, and supposedly Robert E. Lee said, the Fighting 69th. So after this battle was done, you could imagine the worst part was the aftermath. Bodies littered across the fields, dying, moaning, crying out for water. Some bodies dead where they were in positions that are not humanly normal. Arms stretched out, dead bodies with arms stretched out. It was a terrible, terrible sight with nothing but horror for those looking upon it. Just another thing that would add to the possibility that this would be a haunting in the future. Now, with that historical background, that brings us to the actual story at hand. The McDonough School in Baltimore had a yearly tradition of taking its 7th graders to the battlefield as part of a history lesson. Well, 1980 was no different than any other year, and Mr. O'Brien took his class to Antietam to spend the day and learn about this terrible event in history. The visit to Antietam is quite an event for the 7th graders. In fact, everyone always raves about what a great time they have. They go on to the battlefield, they line up in formation, they witness reenactors firing muskets, They take a tour of the battlefield where they're told step by step what occurred throughout that bloody day. So it's something that students look forward to. And in 1980, it was no different. O'Brien took his class there and went through the regular motions for the tour. Now, at the end of that tour, it usually ends through all the day's events at dusk with them at Bloody Lane, which is where the Fighting 69th made their infamous charge. And O'Brien had a tradition or a practice of lining up his students along a fence post and asking them to just spend some time there and contemplate. Think about what they learned that day in the quiet out in the field, and think about the life that was lost here and the price of liberty that was paid. So he did that. He had his students line up where they were, and he left them be for a while to just meditate and contemplate what they had experienced. And when O'Brien got his class back into the classroom, he also had a practice of asking each one of the students to sit down and write an essay, a short essay, as to exactly what they experienced during their contemplation, their meditation about the day's events. So he did it this time as well. And each one of the students put together their own individual essay. Now, like I said, O'Brien was a veteran of this, and he was also open to a lot of different things that traditionalists may not be. He had experienced in the past ghostly encounters, and also in prior classes had read accounts in these essays of students who had experienced the unexplainable. So it was not a surprise when he started to read these essays and learned about what people had experienced, or these kids had experienced or heard. One of the things they heard was chanting, disembodied chanting out of nowhere. But this time there was something different in the essays. In fact, many of the kids wrote something similar, and that was that they heard Christmas carols being sung. Now, this puzzled O'Brien, and to the point that how could he have heard Christmas songs? I mean, in the past, people have heard gunshots, they've heard screaming, some heard chanting, some heard horses, some heard wagons and cannons. But Christmas carols? What could this be? So O'Brien decided he was going to interview each one of the boys that wrote this down in their essay. But before he interviewed these boys, he noticed one typical consistency among all those that mentioned the Christmas carols, and that was that they were all stationed along the battlefield between the Cannon Monument and the War Department Monument, which was exactly where the Irish Brigade made their charge, called Bloody Lane. So, as he has these individual interviews with the boys, he finds that they all heard one specific Christmas carol, and that was Deck the Halls. Now, O'Brien probed a little bit further and asked these boys exactly what part of the song. Did they hear the whole song? What did they hear about the song of Deck the Halls? And there was one common thread. They all heard fa la 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 la. Now, when O'Brien heard this, a cold chill ran through his spine, because he knew something that he never told the boys, that the Irish Brigade was famous for a specific war chant that they would scream out as they charged. And it was an old Gaelic war cry. And that old Gaelic war cry was "Clear the way." But in Gaelic, it's fa, ba, la, a. Fa, la, 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 la. So is the Fighting 69th doomed to relive that dreadful day over and over and over for eternity? Or is this just an echo from the past? One thing's for sure, the universe wants to make sure we never forget the sacrifices so many made on that day to make sure all men would be free. Thanks for watching.